Hey everyone, Nick Marzinski here at trappinglight.com, and in this video I'm going to start talking about simple retouching techniques. And this sort of thing can be really helpful because a lot of us take pictures of other people, whether that's friends or family, and being able to use Photoshop or Photoshop elements to help these people look their best is a useful thing to be able to do. Now, when I talk about retouching, there's a whole wide gamut of things that people can think about. And in this case, what I want to be talking about are very simple retouching techniques. Minimizing wrinkles, fixing some wayward hair, brightening eyes and teeth, and smoothing skin. I'm not going to be discussing things like resculpting faces or bodies, and that's something that can be done within Photoshop, and you'd probably want to be using the liquify filter to do it. But it's not something that I really have that much experience with, and besides, to me, that kind of technique feels a little bit like lying. So let's get started with the more simple and the more mundane sort of things. Here I have a picture of my oldest daughter that I shot for our Christmas card a few months ago. And this was done in my basement in front of a white sheet with a shoe-mounted flash on the camera. And I bounced the flash off the ceiling, and you can tell that because under her chin here you can see the shadows from that. Now, this is not obviously the most sophisticated setup, but it's what I had available at the time, and it gets the job done. So at this point, I've already made all of my exposure and contrast adjustments to the image, and I'm happy with the way that it's looking from a tonal perspective. And now I want to move into actually retouching the image and making sure that my daughter looks as good as she can. Whenever I retouch, I find it's best to start with the smallest things and correct those first. So things like wrinkles and hair and that sort of thing. And then once those simple, small corrections are done, at that point, then it's time to move into doing the more global corrections like skin softening that affect more of the picture. So the takeaway from this is to start off small and then move to large. The other thing that's important, and I've been pushing this in pretty much all of my videos here, is to maintain a non-destructive workflow in Photoshop. Retouching can be very dicey. We all know what faces look like. We've known what faces look like since we were born. And if you mess up when you retouch, it's generally going to be fairly apparent. Because of that, you want to be able to back out of your edit if you find out that it's not working. And by maintaining your original image and then doing your retouching work on layers that are above that in the layer stack, you're always able to get back to your original if you need to. So in keeping with that, with this image, the very first thing I'm going to do is to make a new blank layer by clicking down here on the new layer icon in the layers palette. And so I get my blank layer, and I'm going to label this retouching just so that I know. Yeah, I'm going to label it retouching. And I'm going to actually even be more specific and call this healing brush. So I know exactly what retouching I'm doing. Now I'm going to grab the healing brush from over here in my toolbar. Now, there's two different types of healing brushes that you've got here. You've got a spot healing brush and you've got a regular healing brush. There's also these other tools here, the patch tool, the content aware move tool, and the red eye tool, depending on the version of Photoshop or Photoshop elements that you're using. Some of these last three might not be there. In this case, in this tutorial, I'm only going to be working with the spot healing brush and the healing brush. And I'm going to start out with the spot healing brush. So let me zoom into the picture. I'm going to press Control and the space bar, which switches to a zoom, and then I'm going to just click and drag to the right to zoom in. And here's how the spot healing brush works. I'm going to find an imperfection, in this case a freckle. I'm going to put my brush over it, and then I'm going to click with my healing brush layer selected, and you can see that the pimple just simply vanishes. Now, because the healing brush is actually a brush, you can use a lot of the same keyboard shortcuts than you would for a brush. So to make it bigger or smaller, you can use the left and the right bracket keys. And you also have settings up here in the brush for the size, the hardness, and the spacing. For hardness, it's very tempting to want to take the hardness all the way down to 0, and I really wouldn't recommend that because it gives you a very small area to correct. So keeping the hardness in sort of a middle area here, I think sets a nice compromise between having a large enough brush where you've got an area that will be fully corrected, as well as keeping a bit of feathering in there so you don't have a hard edge to your correction. So with the spot healing brush, I'm just simply going to go around and find the freckles that I want to get rid of and just position it over them and click the button. Now, since I'm working on a new layer here, and if you're working on a new layer, which you should be, it's very important up at the top of the toolbar here to make sure that you've got this sample all layers selected. And what that means is that it's going to actually select from not only the layer that you're on as well as any visible layer that's below it. You want it to do that because you're working on a blank layer. Next, you've also got these different types up here. Generally, I'd like to keep it on content aware. If you're using an earlier version and you don't have something like content aware, proximity match is the next best thing. My mode here, which gives you a lot of brush blend modes like you would expect to see if you were using like a layer blend mode, I have it set to normal all of the time. So it's just a matter of finding areas that need correction and then correcting them. Now, if you make a little bit of a mistake like I did right here, just press Control Z or Command Z to undo it and then try again. Because it's content aware, sometimes it doesn't sample from the area that you want it to sample from. And here's another thing that's important to know about the spot healing brush. It is a spot healing brush, meaning that it's best for very small areas. So I've got these dry areas of skin underneath her nose here, and I can use the spot healing brush to try and get rid of those. But I generally want to take small little samples when I'm doing that and not be too big. Otherwise, sometimes it can give me some effects that I don't want. So if I just click like this and go, then you can see that it takes its sample. It doesn't necessarily tell me where it's taking its sample from, and I just get this awful look here. And so it's very important to just go through and very small clicks and brush strokes in order to correct that. And even that doesn't look so good. So go into my history palette up here and get rid of a whole bunch of those. Let me see if I can do that a little bit better. That looks okay. Don't like that. So the takeaway from this, that looks okay. I think that looks okay. It doesn't look great. Let's redo that. The takeaway from this is to really be very careful when you're correcting anything larger than small blemishes with the spot healing brush. Okay, so I've gone through. I've made corrections to most of the freckles that I'd want to get rid of in the image. And let's see if I can just correct this. Sometimes there we go. That works. That looks pretty good. I've made corrections to most of the freckles that I'd want to in this image using the spot healing brush, and it's great on freckles. It's great on small stuff. If you're taking pictures of teenagers, the spot healing brush will get rid of pimples wonderfully. But now that I've done that, I want to move into correcting some of the larger areas. And before I do that, I also want to point out another thing, which is to be careful when you're doing retouching and you're removing things like with the spot healing brush. Be careful with removing distinctive marks. Okay, think of, for example, a supermodel with a mole on her upper lip. Say someone like Cindy Crawford or Kate Upton or something like that. Now, if you were retouching a picture of that model, and frankly, if you were, I'm a little surprised that you're listening to my lowly little tutorial here, but if you were, you wouldn't want to spot heal that mole away because that's part of her look. So be careful when you're using this and make sure that you're not retouching away a facial characteristic that defines a person. So let's move on to something that's a little bit larger, like these areas under my daughter's eyes where there's a few lines and there's a little bit of discoloration there, a little bit of darker color there, and I'd like to get rid of that. Now in this case, yeah, the spot healing brush might work, but it's a larger area. Because of that, I'm going to switch over to the healing brush. Okay. Now in this case, I'm going to want my sample size. My sample up here set to current and below. I don't want it set to just the current layer because it is on a blank layer. So I want it to be sampling anything that's below it. I also want my source set to sample. Do not set it to pattern. It will give you something that you most assuredly do not want. So keep it set to sampled. And then my mode is set to normal. Again, with this, it's a brush, so I can resize it using my bracket keys, or I should be able to. So I just come over here and click it, and Photoshop pops up a warning. Now this shows a difference between the spot healing brush where I don't need to set a sample, and the healing brush. Okay, the spot healing brush, it automatically samples from right around the area it's correcting, and it uses that sample to fill in the center. So it's removing a blemish, and then it's automatically matching the skin tone. In the case of the healing brush, I need to tell it where it should actually be grabbing its sample from. Okay, and in order to do that, I'm going to just hold down the Alt key or the Option key if you're working on a Mac, and that changes my cursor from the brush to a bullseye here. At this point, I pick a sample area, and the sample area should have roughly the same skin tone as the area that I'm correcting. So I don't want to, go over to an area that is completely different. I don't want to, if I'm correcting this area under her eyes, I'm not going to want to be going down to her neck here and choosing my sample point. I'm going to want to be staying right near where I'm correcting in terms of tone. And then once my sample is selected, then I can just come right over here, and now I can use bigger brush strokes, and the sample, or the healing brush, the regular healing brush, will take care of that, even though I'm using a larger brush stroke, because now I'm telling it precisely where to sample from. So that's the difference. That's the biggest difference between the spot healing brush and the healing brush. The spot healing brush, it samples on its own. You don't get the choice. The healing brush, you're actually telling it where to sample from. Okay? And using the healing brush where you tell it where to sample from, this sort of technique works really well on wrinkles and that sort of thing. So if you want a way to distinguish between the two, the spot healing brush is kind of like a Stridex or an Oxy pad. It's really great at removing pimples and that sort of thing. Whereas the healing brush is more like a Botox injection. It's great at removing lines, discoloration, things that you need a long correction for. So that's really a start to the simple stuff with retouching, and that's where I'm going to leave it today. But before I'm done, if this is as far as you're taking the retouching here, there's one more thing that you're going to want to do, and I'm just going to zoom out a little bit more. What you're going to want to do once you're done doing these simple retouches is you're going to want to take the opacity of this layer that you've created here to do your retouching, and you're going to want to lower it just a little bit. We're not talking about a lot. We're talking about maybe lowering it down to maybe in the mid 70s, and maybe even a little bit higher than that. And the reason why you want to do that is it brings back a slight amount of detail, and it prevents that plasticky, over-retouched look on your image that they can sometimes get. Okay, so once you're done doing your retouching, and this is before right here, so you can see the area under the eyes, and you can see a couple of her freckles there, and then this is the after. So very, very slight retouching. Okay, but taking the opacity down of this retouch layer helps to keep the person looking natural and not like you've done a whole lot of Photoshop work, which is really what you want. You want it to look like a very natural image. Okay, so that's it for now. In the next video, I'll continue discussing retouching techniques, but in the meantime, look over some of the pictures in your portfolio and see if some of them of your friends, of your family, might not benefit from just a little bit of slight retouching like the techniques that I just went over. My name, again, Nick Marzinski with TrappingLight.com. Thanks for watching, everyone.